Hello, welcome to Z Marie Design. Let's create a quilt starting with a pre-printed quilt panel. So let's get started. My quilt panel measures 24 by 44. I've chosen this fat quarter bundle in these coordinating fabrics that I will create my 4-inch border. I will cut these in 4.5-inch squares to create a scrappy look. I've also chosen 1.5 yards of fabric to create my backing, my thin inner border, and my binding strips. I begin by squaring up my quilt panel. I folded it in half and I put the fold on one line on my cutting mat, and I'm going to line up the lines on my cutting mat with my ruler so that I can get a straight cut. And I will do this on both sides of the quilt panel. Now I have 2 straight edges and I'm going to measure the width again. I'm going to cut this panel down a little later after I've finished squaring everything up. Next, I'm going to cut off these selvage edges. I'm going to put the straight line that I just cut on a line on my ruler on the top and the bottom. Place my ruler on the line on the cutting mat on the top and the bottom, and then make my cut straight across to make it square. And now I am remeasuring, and I've decided that instead of making this a blanket, I wanted it to be a wall hanging, so I'm going to cut it 28 by 22. The bottom piece of the panel that I've cut off, I'm going to use that to create my label, my embroidered label. So now that I have my measurements, I'm going to now use my backing fabric to cut my inner border. And since this is directional fabric, I'm just making sure to cut it that way. So before cutting my strips, I'm going to square up this backing fabric. I put the fold of the fabric along the edge on the cutting mat on one of the lines, and I'm going to match up my ruler at the top and the bottom on one of the lines on the cutting mat to make my first straight edge cut. And as you notice, I have my fingers on the side of the ruler and I'm walking it up. That's to keep the ruler from shifting as I make that first cut. Next, I'm going to cut my strips for my inside border. I want my strips to measure 1 inch, and I'm going to cut these at 1.5 inches. I'm going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So just measuring on the side, measuring on the top of the fold, walking my fingers up again on the ruler, making my cuts. So now for my inside borders, I've cut those the length of my panel. I'm going to fold it in half and mark my border. I'm going to fold my quilt panel in half and mark that center. And then I'm going to pin it first at the center, Then I'm going to pin it at each end, and then I will fill in with pins from that center to the bottom and from the center to the top. That helps to make sure that my border is not wavy when I sew it on. I also sew it on with a walking foot, again taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I press that seam allowance toward the border, and my border does not come out wavy. I'm going to take my measurements again so that I can cut the strips for the top and cut the strips for the bottom. If I have to piece those, I will, but I think my strips are long enough for the width, so I didn't have to piece that. So now, I'm sorry this is off camera, but I folded it in half, and I folded the quilt panel in half, found the center. I pinned at the center first, pinned at the top and the bottom, pinned in the middle, and then I was able to sew 1/4 inch seam allowance and press. Next, I'm squaring up my fat quarter, and I am cutting 4.5 inch strips to prepare to cut my 4 inch squares. So next I'm just going to cut 4.5 inch squares out of all of my fat quarters. And then I will piece the border together. Now that I have all of my squares sewn, once again I'm going to take my measurement. I'm going to start on the side borders first, and I'm going to now piece those together. I'm going to lay them out first just so I can see how I'd like for those squares to lay out, and I'm taking into account my directional prints. I sew them right sides facing, take a 1/4 inch seam allowance and press to one side. And now I have my scrappy borders for both sides of the quilt. And I'm going to fold it in half, crease it, put a pin there, fold the quilt top in half, crease that center, put a pin there, and then right sides facing, I'm going to start pinning at the center just like we did for the inside border, pin at the top and the bottom, and then fill in with the pins. Sewing 1/4 inch seam allowance, again I'm going to press the seam allowance toward the border. I have both of my side seams now attached for the outside border. Next I'm going to again take the measurement for my quilt, and I'm going to start piecing my top and bottom border. Even with all of the math that I did in order to get this just right, I still was off in my piecing. So as I did my measurements, I realized that I had to take a bit more seam allowance on a few of those squares so I can get this to fit just right on the top and the bottom border. So I took a larger seam allowance on 3 of the squares. Once I've sewn that larger seam allowance, I'm going to trim that seam allowance now to a 1/4 inch and then press it again. If you know a better way of making sure that this math fits, just leave some comments down in the comment section. That can maybe help us along a little bit if we ever decide to do this again. So now I'm going to find the center again of the top and the bottom border. I'm going to find the center of the top and the bottom of the quilt, and I'm going to pin it in the center, pin on each end, and then fill in with the pins. Because now I have a new center because I had to take that additional seam allowance. But we're going to make it work, and it'll still turn out to look really nicely. So I'm just pinning in my center. just wanting to make sure that my borders are fitting. And now I have it all pinned in place. I'm going to take it to the sewing machine, take a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then press that seam allowance toward the border. Now both of my borders are on, the inside border and the outside border. I'm now laying out my quilt top onto the backing fabric and the batting, and I'm going to trim it so that I have at least 2 to 3 inches all the way around before I pin baste it together. So now that's my batting. I'm using a 80% cotton, 20% polyester. But I realize that the backing fabric is a directional print, so I'm just making sure that my backing fabric with this directional print is laying the right way. And we're now going to sandwich this together. And I'm going to be pin basting. Again, I have my quilt top on. I have my backing fabric where the wrong side is facing up. And I put the batting down where the skim is facing the wrong side of the backing fabric. Then I put the quilt top down where the right side is facing up. I start pinning in the middle, and then I pin all the way up coming vertically, and then I pin going horizontally, and then I fill in all of the pins about 2 to 3 inches. I'm using my chopstick there to help me close the pins. It's just a lot easier on the fingers to have that chopstick to help. There are other tools on the market to help you close those pins as well. Now everything is pin basted. I'm going to take it to the sewing machine, and I'm going to be doing free motion quilting, and I'll just do a really large stippling along this. Since this will be a wall hanging, I don't have to do really dense quilting, so this will be a large stippling on there. I'll roll it up at the top and the bottom to help it fit in my machine, and then I will be right back after I'm done stippling and show you the next step. So now you can see my stippling on the front. I used a light gray thread to do the stippling. And now I'm going to square up the quilt. I'm going to take my ruler, putting one line at the end of that bottom border, putting the edge of the ruler on the side of the border, and then I'm going to trim off that backing and that batting that's extending over. And again, making sure to walk your fingers so that that ruler doesn't move. And I will do that all on all 4 sides. And just squaring up the quilt at the side and at the top. And this is my last side that I need to trim. And then we'll get ready to attach the binding. Now to attach the binding, my binding is going to be 2.5 inches. And again, I'm cutting this from the remaining of my backing fabric, so I'm going to piece it together. I'm going to take my first strip and I'm going to lay it down right sides up horizontally. I'll lay the next strip right sides facing vertically. Then I'll draw a line from that top corner to the bottom corner. And this will be your sew line. So I'm going to put some pins there, take it to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew right on your marked line. So when you fold it over, you'll have a mitered edge there to connect your strips. And I will continue doing this until I have enough binding that will cover the outside edge of my quilt. And then I'm going to press that over, and I'm going to fold my binding in half, wrong sides facing, and I'm going to press, making sure to cut off that excess seam allowance where you've connected your binding, your strips. fold wrong sides facing, and I'm going to press all along this binding edge. You want your raw edges to meet. I'm going to roll it up once I have enough binding, and I'm going to hold it together with a rubber band just so that it doesn't get in the way as I'm sewing. Now I'm going to leave about a 10-inch tail that's going to be unsewn, and I'm going to start at the bottom edge of the quilt, pinning everything in place. When I get to the corner, I'm going to measure out a 1/4 inch from the edge, and that's where I'm going to stop sewing. So I will start there in the center and backstitch at the beginning, backstitch at your 1/4 inch in at that marking. And now that you have that first part of the strip sewn on, remember you're leaving a 10-inch tail, it's time to create your mitered corner. So you've stopped a 1/4 inch from the edge. You're going to fold that strip, fold it out away from the quilt, and then fold it right back on top of itself to create that mitered corner so that raw edges are meeting. Let's do it again. Fold it up away from the quilt, fold it back onto itself. I'm using a pin there to help me. And then you'll continue to pin it on where the raw edges are meeting, the raw edges of the quilt and the raw edges of the binding. And then you will back stitch at the beginning and continue to go down. Once you get to that next corner, you will again stop sewing a 1/4 inch from the end, and then you will continue to do that binding. And I've sewn my binding all the way around. I've left that 10-inch strip at the bottom where I didn't sew it. And I'll show you how to continue to attach your binding to the quilt. So when I got around to the other corner, I stopped sewing. Again, I left about 10 inches of space there at the beginning that's not sewn. I'm going to lay that out where the raw edges are meeting. And now I've stopped sewing where I have another tail. And now I'm going that ending part, I'm going to fold that so to create a fold right at the edge of the raw edge of where the beginning of the binding stopped. I'm going to make a mark at the fold on both sides, opening it up so that your mark will go all the way across. Now the ending part of the binding there, hoping this makes sense, you're going to face it out where it's going horizontally away from the quilt. Your beginning part of your strip, you're going to lay that right side facing vertically below the line that you marked. And then you're going to pin. You can just do a pin basting, so just pin it in place horizontally, and then just double check to make sure that the binding fits and that your fold is correct. So now once you know that it's correct, you're going to stitch along that diagonal the same way you did when you connected the binding strips. I just come back through with my ruler and my marking tool, and I'm going to mark my sew line. And I'm going to sew along that sew line. Come back before you make any cuts and just double check that everything fits. The binding strip fits the quilt, and the binding strips that are connecting are going in the right direction. Everything fits. Press that seam open. Press everything wrong sides facing on the binding, and then continue to attach your binding like you did before. Backstitching at the beginning and backstitching at the end. And then your binding is continually connected all the way around. So now let's create that mitered corner. I'm going to clip my seams, making sure that you don't clip through your thread. I'm going to clip all 4 corners. And then I'm going to come through and I'm going to fold my binding strip so that it goes toward the back. I'm feeling for the edge of the quilt. I can feel the edge of the quilt, and that's where I want that fold to go, right up to the edge of the quilt there. I'm going to put a few clips right in place there, and then I'm going to create that miter. I put a pin in there just to hold it in place. And then I'm going to hand stitch my binding on first. I do just a simple blind stitch there as I hand stitch all the way around. And then I'm going to come back through and I'm going to do a decorative stitch after I do the hand stitching. And the decorative stitch that you use should be similar to your quilting stitches you've already attached, and your quilt is all done using a pre-printed panel. Now I had extra strips that were left, and this is what I created, an extra quilt. So I hope you like this project, and I hope